2015 Formula 1 season look like if Mercedes and Sebastian Vettel were not there? Thank you to Miguel for the idea of removing Sebastian as well from 2015. And just to say, yes, Kimi has no teammate. Ferrari are just running one car here. We kick off with Australia for round one, the Australian Grand Prix in Melbourne. The race that's actually on this weekend when this video goes up. And it's a brilliant start for Williams driver Felipe Massa. He ends up taking pole position for this Grand Prix. And that pole position, he manages to turn it into a race win come the race day on Sunday. A race that sees, well, it sees the two Manor cars not participate in the race, and it sees a couple of non-starters from Massa's teammate Valtteri Bottas, Danny Kvyat down at Red Bull on his Red Bull debut, not exactly going to plan, and also Kevin Magnussen standing in for Fernando Alonso after that weird crash in testing. And with quite a few retirements as well, then there ends up only being 8 classified finishers. Second place being taken by Felipe Nasr for Sauber, and then Daniel Ricciardo, the homeboy from Australia, he rounds off the podium in P3. Round 2 is off to Sepang for the Malaysian Grand Prix, a track that many people would love to see come back on the calendar. And Daniel Ricciardo, the man who finished P3 in Melbourne, he ends up taking pole position for Malaysia. The pole position doesn't turn into even a podium come race day. He ends up finishing down in P7 to end up with, as it's Kimi Raikkonen getting his first race win of the season, his first points of the season even, after his retirement in Australia. He's followed home by the two Williams cars of Valtteri Bottas and Felipe Massa rounding off the podium. Meanwhile, further down the grid is his first points in Formula 1 for Max Verstappen, the young 17-year-old youngest driver to score points in Formula 1. He's up finishing in P4 in his second race in Formula 1. Round 3 is off to Shanghai for the Chinese Grand Prix. It's pole position for Felipe Massa for Williams. 2 poles in 3 races for the Brazilian driver. He's having a very strong start to the season. Williams with quite a good car this year, but it's not a race win for him. It ends up being second for him ahead of his teammate Valtteri Bottas, the two Williams having a Williams 2-3 once again. But it's Kimi Raikkonen who takes the race victory, his second win of the season, his second win in a row. He's getting an early run on things, quite a good early start on this. He's sole Ferrari on the grid. And new for round 4, it's off to the track that for the last few years has been the season opener. It's off to Sakir in Bahrain for the Bahrain Grand Prix. Kimi Raikkonen has been on a heck of a run the last couple of races. That is continuing now here in Bahrain as he not only takes pole position, but he converts that pole into a race victory on Sunday with the fastest lap. Again, not that you get points for fastest lap at this time in Formula 1, but it's basically a hat trick for him. It's domination for him in Bahrain. He's followed home by the other Finn of Valtteri Bottas on the grid, finishing up in second place, and Daniel Ricciardo rounds off the podium in P3, getting his second podium of the season. The Spanish Grand Prix is up for round 5, a track that Mercedes tend to go quite well at, but there's no Mercedes here. However, there is some Mercedes powered cars. One of them is being driven by Valtteri Bottas down at Williams, and he takes full advantage of things, and he continues his strong form at the start of the season, aside from that DNS, and he takes pole position for the Grand Prix, for the Spanish Grand Prix, and he ends up getting the race win, his first ever race victory in Formula 1. He scores it this afternoon ahead of Kimi Raikkonen finishing in second place, and then Felipe Massa rounds off the podium for Williams 1-3. And now 5 rounds in, let's have a little look at how the championship is shaped up in this early stages of this season. 5 rounds into the season, it's being led by Kimi Raikkonen down at Ferrari on 93 points. He's got a little bit of a gap back to Felipe Massa, who's currently sitting in second place on 79 points, but there's not a massive gap back to Valtteri Bottas in third on 76 points. So we've kind of got an early kind of runaway 3 here of the Williams boys and Kimi Raikkonen for Ferrari, kind of making a bit of a runaway up in the top for the championship. And there's a 20-point gap back from Bottas to Ricciardo in the championship. It's currently sitting in 4th place on 56 points. Well, the top 5 is being rounded off by Romain Grosjean for Lotus on 38 points. 6th place is currently heading the way of Felipe Nasr in the Sauber car on 33 points, while 7th place is heading the way of Carlos Sainz on 27 points. A few points back further from that, and you'll find Sergio Perez on 23 points, while rounding off the top 10 is a tie between Max Verstappen and Marcus Ericsson on 16 points each, but Verstappen is currently sitting ahead on countback. A look at the Constructors' Championship now, and we see that Williams are, after their strong start to the season of getting several podium finishes, are currently leading the Constructors' Championship on 115 points. Ferrari currently sitting in second place with Kimi on 93 points, while third place goes the way of the Red Bull boys on 78 points. 4th place currently heads the way of Sauber on 49 points, while they're just 6 points ahead of 5th place people Toro Rosso on 43 points. 6th place you'll find Lotus on 38 points, as well Grosjean's points because Maldonado has not scored anything yet, and then 7th place is gonna be Force India on 36 points. 8th place you'll You'll find McLaren on 10 points, and then Manor are yet to get off the ground. They're still on 0 points. The streets of Monaco are the next hosts of a Formula 1 race for round 6 for the Monaco Grand Prix. Daniel Ricciardo has gone quite good here during his time in Red Bull, and that's going to show this afternoon in Monaco as he ends up taking pole position for the Grand Prix. It does not translate into a race victory for him, however. That ends up going the way of his teammate Danny Kvyat getting his first ever podium and race win in Formula 1 this afternoon. Did have a little debate about whether Ricciardo would have pitted under the late Verstappen safety car or not, but by that point I believe Kvyat was already ahead of Ricciardo, like in the actual Monaco Grand Prix, so we'll just leave it at that. But Kimi Räikkönen ends up rounding off the podium this afternoon in Monaco. Next up, we make a jump across the pond to Canada for the Canadian Grand Prix in Montreal, Canada. Kimi Räikkönen finished third in Monaco. He ends up taking pole position for the Canadian Grand Prix. Doesn't turn into a race win for him. He ends up finishing in second place. The race win goes the way of Valtteri Bottas. Another track that has proved quite good for Mercedes power in the last few years for Mercedes cars. Again, no Mercedes, but there's a Mercedes powered Williams, so close enough. Valtteri Bottas takes the race victory though, ahead of Kimi Räikkönen in second, and then Felipe Massa returned to the podium after his difficult race in Monaco that both Williams cars actually had. But as we head across to the next race in Austria for the Austrian Grand Prix, then Felipe Massa continues his momentum from finishing third in Canada to getting a hat-trick in Austria of pole, fastest lap, and race victory this time out. And it ends up being a Williams 1-2 actually, with Valtteri Bottas finishing up in second place, and then third place goes the way of none other than Nico Hülkenberg in the Force India. Massa's form continues though as we head on over to the British Grand Prix for round 9 at Silverstone. He takes yet another pole position and is yet another Williams 1-2 as Massa also gets fastest lap and the race victory. He's really helping himself here in the championship hunt against Bottas and Raikkonen, who ends up finishing P5 in Hungary, and of course he retired in Austria. Bottas as well doing good on gaining points on Raikkonen, and Bottas finishing second here like he did in Austria, and then third place ends up going the way of Danny Kvyat this afternoon. While further down the field, it is first points in Formula 1 for Roberto Merhi and Will Stevens. The two Manor cars both finishing in the points as there is quite a few retirements and a DNS, but they're in the points nonetheless. And now for the final race before the summer break, we head over to Hungary for the Hungarian Grand Prix. Daniel Ricciardo won this race in 2014, not from pole position, but he is going to find himself on pole position this time out. And he holds on to that P1 spot in the race, unlike the last time he was on pole, which was Monaco, where his teammate won. It's still a Red Bull 1-2, but it's Daniel Ricciardo P1 and Danny Kvyat P2. Kvyat does not get ahead of Ricciardo in the late stages this time around, because, well, Ricciardo doesn't hit a pit for a wing change after hitting a Mercedes that isn't there. And then the final step on the podium is rounded off by, well, let's just say the Verstappen era of him being up there scoring podiums is starting early, as the Dutchman finds himself finishing up in P3 this afternoon. But rather fitting, I feel, that it was Daniel Ricciardo that ends up winning this Grand Prix, given he was quite good friends with Jules Bianchi, who of course sadly lost his life just prior to this race weekend. And now as all the drivers head off to God knows where in the summer break, let's have another look at the championship standings and see how things are shaping up. And we have some really interesting battles going on here. Felipe Massa, after his form of winning a couple of races in a row there, is leading the championship now on 146 points. He has a gap of 8 points back to his teammate Valtteri Bottas, who's now sitting in second place on 138 points, and Kimi Räikkönen is only a further 2 points back from that on 136. The championship battle isn't the only place where it's close. It's not as close with the Red Bulls, mind you, in 4th and 5th. Daniel Ricciardo sitting on 4th on 106 points, and Danny Kvyat behind him on 90 points in 5th. But behind that, it is very close. And then there's the 6th, 7th, 8th battle going on right now between Romain Grosjean on 56 points in 6th place, Sergio Perez in 7th on 55 points, and on 54 points is Nico Hülkenberg. So they've got their own kind of battle going on here. And then the last 2 points in the top 10, you have Felipe Nasr on 49 points, and then finally Max Verstappen on 41 points, their own battle going on there. And then in the constructors, it's still Williams leading the way on 248 points, and they've got an almost 100 point lead over Red Bull now in second place on 196 points. They've got a decent gap of 60 points ahead of Ferrari, who are sitting in third with just Kimi's points, 136 points. And then Force India and Lotus are rounding out the top 5 on 109 and 80 points respectively. But only 3 points behind Lotus, you'll find Sauber on 77 points, and they're just one singular point ahead of Toro Rosso on 76 points. There's 30 points between Toro Rosso and McLaren, who are on 46 points, and then the Manor are on 3 points right now at the bottom of the table. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and you haven't done so already, maybe you're new around here, then why not hit the subscribe button to stick around for more videos like this, other content I do, other Formula 1 content. Drop a like if you're enjoying the video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, but let's get back to it. Back from the summer break, and it's off to the Belgian Grand Prix in Spa-Francorchamps, one of the Formula 1's most loved circuits, and it ends up being Valtteri Bottas taking the pole position this time out. However, it doesn't translate into even a podium for him. In fact, none of our top 3 are on the podium, finishing in 4th, 5th, and 7th respectively. The podium places actually end up going the way of Sergio Perez finishing up in P3 for Force India, behind Dani Kvyat, who ended up taking the fastest lap as well in second place for Red Bull. But the race winner, and the first French driver to win a Grand Prix since Olivier Panis in 1996, is Romain Grosjean. Romain Grosjean, a driver kind of renowned for crashing, to word it one way. He could be quick on his day. He could be quite quick. And he was that afternoon in Spa. He ended up taking a podium in real life, and in this universe, it's not just a podium, it's a race victory at the circuit where he caused a bit of a hell of a crash a few years previous. But from there, it's off to Monza for the next race for the Italian Grand Prix. The Tifosi will be hoping for a good result, and it starts off strong with Kimi Raikkonen delighting the Tifosi with a Ferrari pole position at Monza. That only translates into P3 come race day, however, as the Williams cars proved just too strong for Raikkonen, as Williams going to take a 1-2 finish, with Felipe Massa taking the race victory ahead of Valtteri Bottas finishing up in second place. It's off to Singapore for the next Grand Prix, the streets of Singapore, where Alexander Rossi makes his Formula 1 debut, stepping in for Robert Mary, who is stepping out for a couple of races. But while the American gets acquainted with the Manor car and with Formula 1, it is all smiles for Daniel Ricciardo. Although, mind you, when is it not all smiles for Daniel Ricciardo? But it really is all smiles this time, as he ends up taking not only pole position, but he turns it into fastest lap and race victory come race day, having a very, very good Singapore Grand Prix. It ends up being Kimi Raikkonen and Valtteri Bottas, who end up rounding off the podium this evening. Japan plays host to the next Formula 1 Grand Prix, and Japan is a circuit where Valtteri Bottas has gone quite well up before, and he's going to go well here this afternoon, as he ends up taking pole position for the Grand Prix. That pole position ends up being P2 come race day, however, as Kimi Raikkonen proves a bit strong, and the Ferrari Finn ends up going on to take the race victory for this afternoon ahead of Bottas, finishing up in second place, as it's a return to the podium for Nico Hülkenberg. He's been on the podium in pretty much all of these scenarios I've done bar one, but this is the first one where he's got multiple podiums. Championship standings time now, and it's Kimi Raikkonen who's now back in the championship lead on 204 points. He has a gap of 9 points back to Valtteri Bottas, sitting in second place on 195 points. 12 points further back from that, you'll find Felipe Massa. The gap between second and third, a tiny smidge bigger than the gap between first and second, but it's still pretty close up at the top. And then fourth and fifth is still the 2 Red Bull drivers. They're still battling out in their own battle. Daniel Ricciardo still in fourth place on 139 points, with Dani Kvyat, his young teammate, only 14 points behind him on 125. That battle rages on between the 2 Red Bull drivers. There's only 1 point separating P6 and P7, with Sergio Perez on 94 points in P6, and then Romain Grosjean is 1 point further back on 93 points in 7th place. 8th place has gone the way of Nico Hülkenberg, who's kind of fallen out of that battle a little bit, but he's not that far behind them in 8th place. Meanwhile, 9th place you'll find Max Verstappen on 66 points, and then 11 points back from that is Felipe Nasr, rounding off the top 10. In the constructors, and it's still Williams leading the way with 378 points, over 100 points between them and Red Bull in second place on 264, where it's still a 60-point gap back from them to Ferrari on 204 points. 4th place, you'll find Force India on 173 points, while the top 5 is being rounded off by Lotus on 128. They're 13 points ahead of Toro Rosso in 6th place on 115 points, while 7th you'll find Sauber on 95 points, 20 points back from Toro Rosso. And then finally, it's still the same bottom 2 as it's been all season. McLaren on 51 points, and then finally Manor on 3 points. Russia plays host to the next Grand Prix at the Sochi Autodrome. This is a track where Valtteri Bottas normally tends to go pretty freaking well at, and he does end up taking pole position this time out. The race doesn't quite pan out his way though, and he ends up retiring from the race, but because he completed over 90% of the race distance, he is still classified as a finisher, and given he finished in P10, that does mean he does end up still scoring points. Well, a point. The race win, however, actually ends up going the way of Mexican driver Sergio Perez, Force India, getting, I believe, their first race victory. Perez getting his first race victory ahead of Felipe Massa finishing up in second place, and then third place goes the way of the homeboy, the Russian driver on the grid, Danny Kvyat, who I'm sure is going to be absolutely delighted with a home race podium finish. As will Sergio Perez with a first ever race victory in Formula 1. Next up, it's off to the land of the free and the home of the people who are trying to ban TikTok. Can't say I'm really keeping up with that, I mean I live in the UK. But it's the home race of Alexander Rossi, who ends up returning to the grid for the next 3 races down at Manor. But the American on the grid aside, it's Daniel Ricciardo, a man who absolutely loves the United States of America, who ends up taking pole position this time out in the US Grand Prix. It doesn't turn into much in the race. He ends up finishing down in P7 or in a race that sees many retirements. Seriously, quite a few retirements. All of the top guys end up retiring, and that ends up handing the win the way of, well, yep, you guessed it, Max Verstappen. Once again, the Verstappen era is starting early. Just a smidgen over 18 years old, and the man is on the podium, on the top step of the podium rather. Absolute insane. In a Toro Rosso as well. He's followed home though by future teammate Sergio Perez in the Force India, while Jenson Button makes his return to the podium. His first podium in a couple of years. He's on the podium for McLaren. You know, I think in the 2016 one, then when McLaren got a podium, it was at the US Grand Prix as well. Meanwhile, further down the grid, it's his first points in Formula 1 for American driver Alexander Rossi. The American scoring his first points at his home race, and the first American to score points in Formula 1 since Michael Andretti back in the 90s. From Austin, Texas, it's a hop, skip and a jump down to Mexico City for the Mexican Grand Prix at a track where Williams can wrap up the Constructors' Championship. They're currently sitting on 397 points to Red Bull's 312, the gap at 85 points. If the gap is 86 points or more after this race, then Williams have done it. They have sealed the Constructors' Championship, their first Constructors' Championship in absolutely ages. And Red Bull make a good start in trying to make sure Williams don't win the Constructors' Championship, as it ends up being Danny Kvyat taking pole position. Red Bull have historically gone quite well at Mexico City, and that's continuing this time out. It ends up being a Williams race victory though. Valtteri Bottas manages to snatch the race victory, and that with Felipe Massa finishing in P4 means Williams are Constructors' Champions for the first time in many, many years. Red Bull do both finish on the podium though, however, with a 2-3 finish for Kvyat and Ricciardo respectively. Now for the penultimate race of the season, it is off to Sao Paulo, Brazil for the Brazilian Grand Prix. Valtteri Bottas, who currently leads the championship of 222 points, has his first opportunity to wrap up the championship here today. If he wins the race and Raikkonen finishes in 6th place or lower, then Bottas will be world champion. But before he can score any points, he has to face qualifying. And in qualifying, then Kimi Raikkonen does his utmost to make sure that he's going to be in the best position to make sure Bottas does not win the championship early, as he ends up sticking his car on pole position for this Grand Prix, and he keeps a hold of that P1 place into Sunday, as he not only nabs the fastest lap of the race, he nabs the race win, meaning the championship will go down to the final race. But Bottas does manage to limit the damage and finish up in 2nd place, while his teammate gets disqualified from a P5 finish. And then P3 ends up going the way of Nico Hülkenberg. 3 podiums this season for the man that in real life cannot seem to get one. And now ahead of the final race, let's have a look at the battles going on in the championship. But first of all, the big one is the Drivers' Championship battle between Valtteri Bottas and Kimi Raikkonen. 239 points plays 237. It's very close up at the top. It can swing either way. They've kind of left Felipe Massa for dust, who's basically more or less confirmed in P3 in the championship right now. He's kind of just racing for, well, pride, I guess, at this point. But then behind that, there's the battle of the bulls, to word it one way. The battle of the 2 Red Bull drivers, of Danny Kvyat currently sitting in 4th place on 164 points, and then Daniel Ricciardo is falling behind him, but he's only 6 points back on 164. That battle is ongoing. Perez, okay, he's not there, but he's not out of it for that battle for catching Daniel Ricciardo at the very least. He's not completely out of it for Kvyat either, but it would be difficult for him to catch him. The interesting battles are behind him, however. There's a three-way scrap going on right now between Max Verstappen, Romain Grosjean, and Nico Hülkenberg over the 7, 8, 9 positions on the grid. Only 5 points apiece between them. Meanwhile, rounding off the top 10 is Felipe Nasr, who's kind of on his own, I guess. I mean, he's not totally out of the woods from Maldonado and Sainz, but he's kind of okay. In terms of the Constructors' Championship ahead of this final round of the season, the top two places are basically confirmed, with Williams sitting on 452 points in P1, while Red Bull are in second on 334. Behind them, there is still a battle going on though, as the Force India are not fully clear of Ferrari yet. 251 points plays at 237. But the really interesting battle is going on between Lotus and Toro Rosso. They are both sitting on 170 points apiece, so it's going to be interesting to see who wins out in that battle for P5. Behind them though, places are basically confirmed, with Sauber on 117, McLaren on 78, and then Manor on 5. But now let's head on to that final race of the season, the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, where Kimi Raikkonen and Valtteri Bottas will both be trying to make sure that they have the absolute best qualifying that they can have. And well, Kimi Raikkonen in the Battle of the Finns ends up coming out on top in qualifying as he takes pole position to Kimi Raikkonen's P4 starting position. So it's advantage Raikkonen right now out the gate in this Finnish battle. And come race day, Valtteri Bottas would only be able to manage a P10 finish, scoring him just 1 point, which would be all well and good if Raikkonen rather didn't score anything. But he wins the race, which scores you 25 points. So it's advantage Raikkonen, and it's title number 2 for Kimi Raikkonen in Formula 1, ending Ferrari's title drought that has gone on since 2008 when they last won the Constructors' Championship. The podium is rounded off by Sergio Perez in second and Daniel Ricciardo in third place. And with Danny Kvyat finishing down in P7, that P3 finish for Daniel Ricciardo is enough to help him overhaul his teammates and finish in 4th place in the championship, just 3 points ahead of him, while Perez is just shy of catching the both of them. In the Hülkenberg-Grosjean Verstappen battle, it ends up being advantage Hülkenberg as his P4 finish manages him being able to get ahead and keep ahead of both of those drivers, while Grosjean had to settle for a P6 finish and Verstappen does not score any points. But now let's have a look at the final Drivers' Championship standings. In the final Constructors' Championship standings, Kimi Raikkonen is your champion. He's your world champion of Formula 1 in 2015 when you take Mercedes and Sebastian Vettel out of things. He's on 262 points. While second place man, you'll find Valtteri Bottas on 240 points, as Felipe Massa is rounding off the top 3 on 223 points. As I said, Daniel Ricciardo wins out in the Battle of the Bulls and he finishes in 4th place on 179 points, while Danny Kvyat has to settle with rounding off the top 5 in 5th place on 176. 6th place you'll find Sergio Perez on 165 points, while Nico Hülkenberg just manages to clinch P7 in the championship on 116 points, 1 point ahead of Romain Grosjean in P8 on 115. 9th place you'll find Max Verstappen on 109 points, while the top 10 is being rounded off by Felipe Nasr on 76 points. Carlos Sainz is the first driver outside the top 10 on 65 points, while just 2 points back from that you'll find Pastor Maldonado in P12 on 63 points. Jenson Button is your man in P13 on 45 points, while just 4 points back from that you'll find Marcus Ericsson for Sauber on 41 points. Fernando Alonso is sitting on 35 points in the end in P15, and then behind that you have the Manor cars and Magnussen, Roberto Meri and Alexander Rossi both sitting on 2 points, and then finally Will Stevens is the last of the point scorers on 1 point, and Kevin Magnussen did not start that one race he did, so he isn't counted. And now in the Constructors, Williams are your Constructors champions of Formula 1 this season on 463 points. They ended with quite a gap back to Red Bull on 355 points. Force India end up rounding off the top 3 on 281 points, ahead of Ferrari, who finish up on 262 points. 5th place ends up being Lotus, rounding off the top 5 on 178 points. They win out in that battle, ahead of Toro Rosso on 174 points. Sauber end up in 7th place on 117 points, while it's still the same body to it as been all season. McLaren end on 80 points, and then Manor are on 5. And Formula 1 2015 without Mercedes and Vettel is at its end. That's what would have happened. Again, thank you to the commenter for the idea of taking Vettel out of it as well. That was a good idea to end up with, because that ended up being quite a good season to end up with. Up next, 2014, then I do plan on circling back around to 2017, and then I'm going to get into other years. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Drop a like if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe if you're new around here. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.